right, good evening, parents and guests. We're so glad you all are here. My name is Amy King. I'm a 1995 graduate of Chatham Central High School, and I currently teach American history at my alma mater. To begin our program tonight, I would like to introduce to you the 6 students that will present a portion of our program. So we'll start with Leslie de la Sancha Arroyo, Kelsey Huzzy, Matthew Smith, Olivia Jones, Hallie Webster, and Travis Chrisman. They've worked so hard on this. I think we should give them a round of applause, please. Okay, y'all can go sit down. You can go sit down. Really, they worked really hard since October. I wasn't planning to say this, but when we invited Jeff Chrisman and Chris Webster to our class, it was Halloween. So the students have been working on this project about a week before they came to our class. So it's been an ongoing research project. So we're going to start our program tonight with an overview of my expedition to Northern Europe and the Normandy beaches in June of this past year. The objective of the journey was to place teachers together in foreign lands where they would learn and collaborate with one another, and then return home to facilitate a research project with their students. This partnership is known as the Grosvenor Teacher Fellowship, and it is fully funded by the National Geographic Society and by Lindblad Expeditions. Each year, National Geographic opens applications to any educator in the United States, Canada, and the U.S. territories. The application process is extensive, requiring lesson plan submissions and a video journal. Of the approximately 2,500 educators who submit, 50 are chosen. And in February of 2020, I received a phone call that I was one of the 50 to be selected. And I actually found out in my driveway, and I screamed so loud on the phone that the kids thought I had been murdered or something. I don't know. They ran out and were scared. And I just told them I had just gotten this expedition. And then, in addition, I get to go with 3 other educators on the expedition who at that time I did not know them. And we found out we would be traveling to Northern Europe and the Normandy beaches. Of course, what I did not know the night of that phone call is that our expedition would be delayed because of a global pandemic. So, what I now know is that I was able to go on that expedition 2 years later in 2022. We're going to start with a slideshow first about my expedition, and I think it gives you a really good background about what I was able to learn and how I was able to bring that back to Chatham Central. So we're going to start with the picture of the ship on the bottom right, which as Matthew calls the Titanic, but it is not. Thank goodness it did not sink. It is the National Geographic Explorer. And we were on this ship for about 2 weeks, and we docked at 6 different countries in Northern Europe. So it was really nice because we just got a taste of each country, but we slept and ate most of our meals on the ship. Okay, next slide, please. So we met, the 4 of us met in Copenhagen, Denmark on June the 8th. We actually started traveling on the 7th, and we met together in Copenhagen on the 8th. This is a picture of me with my 3 other teacher fellows. Christian is beside of me, and he is a social studies teacher, teaches middle school in Boston, Massachusetts. And next to Christian, the really tall guy, is Carl. He's 6'5". Carl teaches 3rd and 4th graders art. And I'll show you, I put in there several of Carl's paintings. He painted almost every day on the ship. and he's an extraordinary artist and a really neat person. He lives in Denver, Colorado. And next to Carl was my roommate, Rachel. Rachel is an instructional technology facilitator for her entire county school system in Rochester, Michigan. And so we met in Copenhagen. Little did we know we would be the best cohort there is of the 50 people going. They could not have matched 4 people better. This photograph, I've got 2 here in addition to us posing. Both are of one of the oldest churches in Northern Europe. We're able to walk inside of the church. This is like a dome, as you can see there. But there were wooden benches, pews, that I didn't show, but they let us sit in them. And they were hundreds of years old, which was really neat. And then you see the top of the dome from the outside in the picture on the left. Next slide, please. This is also in Copenhagen. This is one of my favorite pictures that I took. I should have said this. All these pictures, I took the photographs. There's a few exceptions. In some cases, some of my shipmates took them and shared with me. But I took this photograph on the right, and I really like all the colors in the buildings and the ship. This really makes me think exactly what Copenhagen felt like. I also want you to notice in all these slides that water is a vital part of these people's lives. They live on the water, and the water provides food and trade and all sorts of things for them. So water is a constant in their life. And a lot of fresh food comes from the water for them. There's the castle in the middle, and we visited that castle. And if you see the bottom left, there is the changing of the guard, and we got to watch that. And then in the middle is this crazy sign that has crazy letters, and I'm not going to attempt to read that to you, but that was the place we ate lunch. And they fed us open-faced sandwiches, which is something that people in Denmark love to eat. And it's basically bread with things on it, and there's no top on it. So they would fry fish and put fish on top with greens, not greens like southern greens, like lettuce. And they would put salted fish like salmon. They would use different types of beef and put that on there. And eggs, like hard-boiled eggs that they had cooked and cut and put on their sandwiches. Next slide, please. This is Lübeck, Germany, and we learned to say it correctly. The L-U with the 2 dots, you read like L-U-R in English, Lübeck. And Lübeck, Germany was also a beautiful place. To the left, you see a ship that we visited. It was one of the oldest ever restored in Germany, and we were able to go on the ship and look around. The name of the ship was the Passat, and you see that name in the middle. There's a lighthouse below the name of the ship there in the photograph. And then to the right is a gentleman that I hooked up with pretty early and had lots of conversations with him. I should tell you that there were approximately 60 to 70 passengers on the ship with us, and they were all paying customers. We were not. We were very fortunate in that. But most of them were from the ages of 65 to 85. They were very wealthy, and they were very retired. So they had a lot of time to travel, and they were so interesting and so interested in us, which was fun. But this gentleman I talked to quite a bit the entire trip. His name is Keith, and we spent about an hour this day talking. And I was telling him about teaching the Vietnam War, which is one of my favorite things to teach in school. And he is a Vietnam veteran. And so he shared a lot of stories with me, and we talked a lot about it. He said he wanted to come on the trail, y'all, to the students. He wanted to come see the trail, and he was really interesting. And then at the end of our conversation, I said, well, Keith, where are you from? And he said, well, this little town outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. And I said, what? Like, I had to go all the way to Germany to meet Keith. But anyway, that was interesting. So he was just a neat person. There were so many on that expedition with us. He actually was there with his wife and his daughter and his 3 grandsons. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another, it looks like a castle on the left, but it was actually a set of gates. And the gates were there to protect the city of Lübeck. And they dated back to the Roman times, which is wild to me. And I took a picture of the roses because I thought they were beautiful. And we were there in June. I should have mentioned this. When we were in Denmark and also Lübeck, the temperature was about 55. So to me, that was frigid. To my roommate, who's from Michigan, it was just right. And she often went around in short sleeves, which I thought she was insane. But the weather was always nice. It rained on us a little one day, and that was about it. But it was nice enough that they had lots and lots of flowers because they also get lots of rain. Also in the bottom picture is it's actually at a canal. There was a bridge, and you see all the locks on the bridge. And the story from our tour guide was that when people fall in love, they take their significant other there and they put a lock on the chain link fence or the fence at the canal. And we thought that was funny and wondered how many of them lasted. But anyway, that was a pretty neat picture, so I took that one. Next slide, please. This is Rachel and myself and Christian on the Zodiac. To get from the ship into inland, you could not go from ship to land because the ship was too big. And the inlets were really shallow and small, and so you had to ride a Zodiac. And that is what we're doing. It's like an inflatable boat, kind of. And so we're doing that. And then in the middle is a really cool picture of a medieval town square. The building behind me that has the little post going into the sky and the gold little medallions on it actually dates back to medieval times. And I'm standing here in the middle of that square. If you notice, all these people are sitting behind me eating, and they just go on with their life while tourists walk around and, like me, take pictures. And if you see on the other side of my shoulder, there's like food trucks. And people will just walk around and get food and eat. I was thinking about this today. It's a totally different lifestyle than what we live in Europe. They really enjoy life, and they don't work too hard. And they see that as very much American and silly. So you would see lots of people out in the middle of the day walking around that live there, eating lunch for like 2 hours and, living their best life, basically. I was also telling my students yesterday that one neat thing I thought about these food trucks, it's not really a truck, it's more like a trailer that they leave there. But they bring in fresh food, so it's really farm to table. And in the evenings, people stop there on their way home from work, walking, and they pick up supper, and it's fresh. And they go home and cook. They don't do like us and go to the grocery store and buy things for like a week. They don't do that. So I thought that was really neat how fresh their food was. Next slide, please. This is the sad slide, I call it. This is a church we visited in Lübeck. It was bombed during the war by the Allies because, of course, this is Germany. And the top picture you see there are the remains of the church bell. And when the church was bombed in the war by the Allies, the bell fell and crashed on the ground, and it has never been touched. And so they have put a protective barrier around it. They let us kind of put our cameras over that to take a picture, but you couldn't get near it. I also want to show you the top left, which is the really sad part. You see these 2 squares, like medallions. They were in the pavement. And when we walked around throughout Germany, there were lots of these. And they would be right outside of homes. The homes didn't look like our homes. It was more like what we would maybe call an apartment or a brownstone. And so you would see sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 of these together. And we asked the tour guide about it. Of course, they're in German, so we couldn't read them. And she told us that everywhere you saw one of these outside the home, that meant that that was a Jewish person who had been taken in the Holocaust. And they had lived there. And that was to mark that. And just to my students, I want to say something that you already know, but how important it is to know your own history, the history of your country, and how important it is to study it and know it, even if it's difficult, you know, even if it's hard. And the Germans, they do not shy away from that. They're very honest about their role in the Holocaust, and they're very honest in teaching their students about that. And clearly you see that in the way they live their life. Next slide, please. This is just one I liked, so I took a picture of it and put it in the slideshow. It's just ribbons across the alleyway. They were having a flower and food festival in Lurbeck when we arrived. It was supposed to start the next day, and everything was very festive, and so I took this photograph. Next slide, please. This is the same thing, flowers that I took pictures of before they were putting them out. They had huge planters of flowers that they were putting everywhere. Next slide, please. This is the Kiel Canal, and I will show you in greater detail on a map in a moment where the Kiel Canal is. It actually runs through Germany, and it saves them hundreds of miles, which is always the point of a canal. And actually, something else that was interesting I wanted to tell you is that our ship had requested to go through this canal 1 year before we did. So there is a long wait to actually go through the canal. And when we arrived to go through it, it was supposed to be during the night. And our soft voice lady, which I'll explain that in a minute, told us that we would probably not get to see the canal because we would all be asleep. And we woke up the next morning and the soft voice came on. And I was telling the students yesterday, the soft voice was the lady in charge of our expedition. And she would literally come on the intercom, which was right above your head over your bed. And I need this in my kids' rooms. But anyway, she would say, "Good morning, good morning, good morning." And she always did it 3 times. And by the end of the trip, you just wanted to stab something in the ceiling because, you know, you'd not gotten enough sleep, which is something else I can talk about. But she would say, "Good morning, good morning, good morning." And then she would tell you the temperature, and she would tell you kind of what to wear for the day and what to expect. And she said that morning, you know, we were supposed to go through the Kiel Canal last night. However, when we arrived, it was under maintenance. So we have not gone through the Kiel Canal, and you will get to experience going through the Kiel Canal today. However, this means our other itinerary agendas are now gone. So we didn't get to do the other things we had planned to do that day because we were behind, but we actually got to see the process of going through a canal, which is much more exciting than it sounds, and how hard the men on the ship work to get that ship through the canal is pretty amazing. Next slide, please. This should show you kind of what that looks like. Once you get in the canal, if you see the top left photograph, that is another ship that was behind us. And if you see on both sides, it was just trees, and like you're in the canal, and it's so peaceful and beautiful. And I went up, like she came on, good morning, good morning, good morning, at like 6:30 in the morning. And so I went up on deck about 7:15 or so, and there was no one out there except myself and our mentor, who was a National Geographic certified photographer. I should talk about that too. But anyway, he was out there with me taking photographs. And it was just he and I, and it was so quiet and peaceful, and the birds were chirping. If you see the picture on the bottom left, there were just homes like to the side, and there would be older men sitting out fishing. So that was really neat. It was just a really peaceful place. Next slide, please. So this is where I'll mention about the other people with us on board. In addition to the staff that just helps people on the ship, like serving food, and the good morning, good morning, good morning lady. There was also specialists, there were scientists, there were historians, archaeologists, naturalists on board with us. And they are there to serve every guest. And so their job is to conduct research while they're on the expedition and to invite people to see what they were doing. It is definitely, Lindblad runs all these expeditions. You can look them up online, and they are absolutely unbelievable. So they go all around the world on expeditions, and you can pay as much as you'd like to go with them. And they have all these people on there that will educate you while you're on the expedition. And for teachers, it was like heaven, because we were the students, which the students think would be a horrible thing to be, but it is wonderful because you're not having to teach, you're getting to learn. And so you have these people who can teach you, and they're conducting experiments, and they're doing all sorts of things, and you get to watch that. So with that said, they asked us to do a presentation to the ship. And they wanted the 4 teachers to talk about our experience, how we received the Grosvenor Teacher Fellowship, and also talk about how we were going to use it with our students. And at that time, I kind of had it in the back of my mind about Mr. Carl. I had gone to Jeff and Amy's house in May or June, I don't remember, Jeff, but it was before I left. And I had talked with them about maybe my students could do something on Mr. Carl. And I knew there might be a good chance that I would have Hallie or Travis in my class the next semester. It turns out I got them both. So then I thought I'd hit the money, you know. And I told them, Jeff and Amy, I said, is there anything you can share with me? Well, of course, you know, it's Amy, so she's done all these wonderful things. And she had created the scrapbook for Mr. Carl before he passed away. And literally everything was in that scrapbook about his military life. It was so remarkable that I took pictures because I couldn't take the scrapbook with me on this expedition, but I took pictures on my phone to share if I could hook up with a historian on board and get some input about it. And in the end, I did, and his name is Stephen Fisher. You'll see Stephen in a minute, and you'll hear my students talk about Stephen. Stephen's British, but his specialty is D-Day. And when Stephen looked at the photographs, he was blown away by Mr. Carl. He said, I have almost never seen someone who's been as many places as this Carl Scott has been. And I said, yeah, it's pretty remarkable, although now I know it's even more remarkable than I realized at the time. But I gave my talk, and I told them I was from, well, I said, I live in Bear Creek, North Carolina. And actually, somebody on the ship knew Southern Supreme, by the way. Yeah, I know, you can't get away from it. So, I mean, they knew that. And I said, yeah, that's where I live. And they said, I told them Bear Creek, and then, of course, I had people ask where that was, and that's like, you can't explain that to people. But I said, you know, I teach at Chatham Central. It's the school I attended. And there is this gentleman who I knew who attended my church, and I think I might get to teach 2 of his great-grandchildren, and he was in D-Day. And I talked about that. I showed some pictures in my speech here. I'm there, if you can tell. It's kind of a bad picture, but I'm in the top left there giving a speech. This is called the Circle of Truth, which is odd. And there was a circle, and you stood in the circle to talk. And I was telling them about Chatham Central and my thoughts on a project about Mr. Carl, because we knew that we were going to the sites of D-Day. And that hadn't happened yet, but it's about to. And afterwards, Stephen came up to me and he said, in his accent, which I will not mock, but he said, you know, I'm writing a couple of books at the same time. And he said, one of them is really a reference book. And basically what I'm doing is I'm cataloging where every single person in the Allied invasion left England, what ship they were on, what time they left, who they were with, and then where they landed at D-Day. And he said, I think I can find your Mr. Scott. And I said, really? And he said, yes. And I had talked to Jeff after that, and the family wasn't sure where exactly Mr. Scott Carl landed. And so I thought, you know, this is really amazing that he's going to be able to do this. And in fact, Stephen came through in a big way, which is what the students are going to show you. And he also made all sorts of videos with them and shared with them and talked to them about how he came about this information. I'm done talking about him, but I want to show you these two drawings in the bottom left. These are from Carl, my fellow Grosvenor Teacher Fellow, who was constantly drawing and doing art on the trip. Next slide, please. This is Amsterdam, Netherlands. Beautiful place, very loud. The picture there in the middle on the water looks so calm and serene. But what it doesn't show you is we were there on Saturday, and it was crazy out in the water. Like everybody was driving boats. I mean, kids that looked like they were 11 years old driving boats, and it felt very dangerous, and it was quite crazy. But this picture, I liked it because it looked so calm and serene. And also you see their naval influence in the photograph to the left. Next slide, please. Something I want to say about the Netherlands is it is below sea level. And you should think of it like New Orleans. Therefore, they have lots of problems with flooding, especially when they have terrible storms. And they've done a lot to stop that. I did not put any of this in the slideshow, but we visited a place called the Delta Works where they have spent millions of dollars to prevent flooding ever again. They had a terrible flooding incident in the 80s, I believe, but don't hold me to that. And hundreds of people died. And so they decided to do something about it. And they're Dutch, so they think there's nothing they cannot do. And so they put their minds to it and engineered this humongous thing that I can only describe looks sort of like two doors that close. And they're able to shut off the ocean, in a sense, and protect the inland areas. So it was really amazing. They also, by the way, offered the U.S. government after Katrina to come over and help us build a system like that in New Orleans, and the U.S. government declined. So I thought I would just throw that out there, since, you know, I'm a history teacher. Okay, this middle picture is me in Amsterdam. The canals were everywhere. People traveled by water. Also, can you see the bikes? And I think I have another bike picture maybe, but everyone rode bikes everywhere. Bikes everywhere. And you didn't see as many cars because there wasn't a lot of space for cars, so they bike a lot. I was telling the students yesterday they were also very, very tall. Like I was short compared to them. The tour guide we had was a lady, and she was 6'1", and she told us both her parents were taller than her. Most people were very, very tall and very thin because all they do is ride bikes all the time. You see the cheese in the top right, which was just in an open air market, and you just walk by and like buy cheese. And below that are flowers that I took a picture of. They had an entire floral market, and it smelled like heaven must smell like. It was so beautiful, smelled so good, and I took pictures there. Actually, Carl took that picture. I should credit him for that. Next slide, please. This is a Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. I did not know that I was that into art. My roommate in college actually was an art major. I never cared anything about it. And before I went on this expedition, I knew we were going to 3 art museums, and so I did a little bit of homework to my students with the help of Miss Bolding. She helped me out with some stuff. And this is a Vermeer, if you don't know. And Vermeer, there's absolutely no telling what this painting is worth. You see how small it is compared to me standing there looking at it. It's called The Milkmaid. Lots of Rembrandts and Vermeers and Van Goghs in this museum. It was really cool to be that close to them. Next slide, please. This is Antwerp, Belgium. We were there on June the 12th. I liked the castle in the middle and the Ferris wheel, and I thought it was cool, so I just took a picture of it. On the right is the Red Star Line Museum, and this is interesting, especially to my students, because we learn about immigration to the United States in my class, and the Red Star Line is where every single person who wanted to come to America from Europe began that journey. And they all went through this building. The building has been converted now to a museum. So it's the same building. We actually saw, and I hate to say it like this, but it's what it looked like. It looked like cattle chutes, and that was where they put people. And people were lined up to put on the ships to go to New York through Ellis Island, which you all know has the Statue of Liberty. So if you were going to America from Europe, this is where you went through, and that was really moving. I'll just finish this part by saying that Albert Einstein went through the Red Star Line Museum. Well, Red Star Line area to get on a ship to come to America. They had pictures of him, his signature where he signed, getting on the ship, which I thought was really neat. Next slide, please. This is Bruges, that's how you say it, Bruges, Belgium. It is the most beautiful city we went to. Bruges is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I don't know if you know what that means, but it basically means nothing has changed inside the city for over 100 years. They're not allowed to build new buildings, so everything there is very, very old and beautiful. When you walk through the city, like where I'm standing there, everything, like everywhere you went, it smelled like waffles, because this is where the Belgian waffle was created. And they have waffle restaurants everywhere. So little cafes where you can eat like real waffle or Belgian waffles, not like stuff we get out of the freezer, like real stuff. And they also had lots and lots of chocolate. I did not take a picture of that, but you see the macaroon tree I did take a picture of. And just say good morning. You say Guten Morgen. That's how you say good morning in Bruges. And we also here had a chocolate tasting, which was very exciting for me because I know some people in this room know this, but I'm allergic to soy, which means I cannot eat chocolate in America because we put a whole bunch of junk in our chocolate. If you didn't know, now you know. There, they don't. So it is the real deal. And they actually get their chocolate from Africa. And we went through this whole process with the Dr. Chocolate, is her name, Dr. Christie. And she was on our trip with us. And she actually lives in Africa and teaches at a university in the United States, but lives in Africa when she's not teaching. And she visits chocolate farms. And the farmers grow the chocolate, and their next stop is Belgium. Every bit of chocolate is shipped to Belgium, and Belgium has these chocolatiers, and they are trained in the old style of making chocolate, which means they do not put other ingredients in their chocolate like we do. They don't put preservatives or anything like that. It also means that with these chocolatiers, your chocolate's going to be very expensive. She gave us a taste test where we tasted about 12 different chocolates, and since I don't get to eat a lot of chocolate, I thought they were all fantastic. Next slide, please. This is lunch that I had. This was the best meal I had, but I can honestly tell you I had very few bad meals. This is at the Zwarthuis, which is the Zwart House. And this is like stew beef, I guess what we would call it. To be most honest with you, I have no idea what the meat was, and I did not ask. But it was fantastic, and it would just melt in your mouth. And they had a live band. I should say that Lindblad is very big on music and indigenous music to wherever you visit. So they had a live band, and the band played music while we ate. On the left, you see one of the storefronts that were in Bruges, and they sell a lot of wooden toys. So I took a picture of that. Next slide, please. This is Caen, France. We're getting to the end of my expedition. Caen is the city that Matthew will talk about that the Germans thought the Allies would come through in the Allied invasion, but that's not what happens. Caen, however, was heavily bombed in the war. I took this picture here of the cityscape from the ship, and I was very proud of it because I thought the sky was so pretty. If you see all these white buildings, they are newer because Caen was almost destroyed in the war, and so everything had to be rebuilt. While we were in Caen, they took us to the World War II Museum in Caen. They have hundreds of artifacts that wash up on the shores of Normandy, the Normandy region, every year. Hundreds of steel artifacts that still wash up, and they restore them and put them in the museum. You see here, well, I should back up. When we got in the museum, we took some pictures and looked around, and then the curator said, I'm going to take you all on a backstage tour. And my heart started already like beating faster because this is my thing, folks, you know. Like I was like, I'm about to be back here with all these artifacts from the war. I thought they're not going to be able to contain me. So I got back there and he said, I'm going to give you 45 minutes to look at and touch whatever you want to. And I looked over at Keith. Keith, remember Keith from Vietnam? And Keith was like, whoo. I said, yeah. So we went through everything we could go through. I do want to show you to the right. There I am standing outside the museum, but to my left is what we call Bouncing Betty. And I had taught Bouncing Betties for years and had never laid eyes nor hands on one. And he explained, the curator, that this is a Bouncing Betty, and I screamed and scared all the old people around me. And I told them, I said, I teach this and I never get to, like, I've never even held one. And the man there, the curator, he said, well, honestly, ma'am, I would give it to you. I was like, no, don't give me that. It'd probably explode on the ship or something. I was like, no. But it was so neat to see an actual Bouncing Betty. If you don't know anything about Bouncing Betties, they were buried in the ground, kind of like a mine, but they would jump up when you stepped on it. And that was why they were called Bouncing Betties and were known to cut a man in half. So they're really horrible things. They're going to be used more in Vietnam, but first seen here in World War II. Last thing I'll say is, do you see right below me, there's three little things. The curator had this tiny box, like this big, and he said, last thing I want to show you, and he opened it, and he like unfolded this tissue paper. And he held it out for us. So there they are laying on tissue paper. And he said, does anyone know what these are? And one of the gentlemen with me said, it looks like shoulder medals. And he said, yes, these belong to Rommel. And I almost passed out. That, if you don't know who Rommel is, you need to come to my class. But Rommel was one of the top German military generals. And he answered only to Hitler. And they have his shoulder medals because when he died, his son gave part of the medals to this museum, which I thought was really cool. And they don't put them on display. Next slide, please. This is Pegasus Bridge. We'll go through these really quickly, but if you look at the bottom, that's a little cafe, which I think is funny, right next to the bridge. Jeff, you can go to the next slide. This is a different angle of the bridge, and I liked it because the ducks were in the picture. And then if you'll go to the next slide, the British, which we don't talk about enough in American history, is how, and I'm sure Carl could have spoken about this a lot, but how we think that only the Americans were in the Allied invasion. And it was an Allied invasion, not an American invasion. And so there were Canadians involved and also British soldiers involved. And the British actually arrived in France the evening before the June 6th invasion that morning. And this is so crazy to me, they dropped out of airplanes on gliders that had no engine and then crash landed at this bridge. They couldn't have an engine because it would be loud. And they were sneaking in a sense. And their objective was to take this bridge, and it was critical to the Allied success in the invasion. And here's a memorial to the commander of the gliders. And I also took a picture of the poppies, because if you don't know, poppies are a symbol of World War in Europe. And I always liked them, so I took a picture. Next slide, please. The very end of the trip is when we got to the best stuff, and that was Saint-Marie-Anglais. I should tell you that Normandy, France, is like we might call the Piedmont. That's what they call Normandy. Normandy is not a town. It's a region. So if we would say we live in the Piedmont of North Carolina, they would say I live in Normandy. So the town here is named Saint-Marie-Anglais. And two things about it. One, you're going to see, not yet, but in the next slide, I'm on the front side of this concrete bunker that I'm standing behind and taking a picture from. And I was zooming out towards the ocean. The Germans built these, and Matthew will go into great detail about that better than I can, but the Germans built these and it took forever. And when he tells you how long it took, you're going to remember this photo because you'll understand why it took so long. So much concrete. And they were very well protected in their bunkers. And some of these bunkers are right on the beach, as he will show you, and some of them are way back. And so I was way back off of the beach, but they were aimed towards the beach. To the right of that, if any of you in here have ever seen the movie, it's really, really old, or read the book, The Longest Day, I think it was written by Cornelius Ryan. Is that right? Okay, thank you. That book talks about a paratrooper who landed on top of the church in the D-Day invasion. And he got hung on the steeple of the church. And when we went to St. Marion Lake, here's the church. Carl and Rachel and I are standing in front of it. Do you see, can you tell from this photograph, there's a white thing hooked on the top of the church? That's a dummy paratrooper. And later, historians discovered that the man who claimed he was hanging from that church steeple and later got lots of money, like he went on a tour in America and told everybody about how he got hung on the steeple and people would give him money and stuff. He lied. He never got hung on the steeple. And they took it down. The people in France, they had this kind of thing and they took it down because it was a lie. And then all the tourists would come and drive them crazy about, why don't you have something about the guy who was hanging from? So they put it back up there. And our tour guide said, it really didn't happen. But I wanted to point that out to you. Next slide, please. Here's Carl and I on the other side. You see how massive this is? And this gun actually is still in working condition. It is in what we would think of like a national park. So it's protected and very heavily guarded. And so, they haven't had any damage to it, thank goodness. But that is a massive gun and massive amounts of concrete around it. Next slide, please. Okay, so this was really, the best part of the expedition. It's when they took us to Omaha Beach. And I walked, you see where I'm standing there. The guy pointing is Stephen, the British historian I was telling you about that found a lot of information for us on Mr. Carl. If you look all the way down the beach, as far as you can look, you can imagine that was where Mr. Carl most likely came, and the students will talk about that. But I walked further down and laid my Chatham Central flag on the sand and some seashells I collected and took a picture. I also want you to notice how much, I'm sorry, it's hard for me not to teach when I'm up here. Do you see how much sand there is? So the Germans thought that the Americans and the British and Canadians would arrive at the Allied invasion at high tide. And therefore, they put in the ground all sorts of, we call them hedgehogs. They were obstacles in the water, and then they would put bombs on them. And the thinking was that the ships at high tide would come over that, hit that bomb that was on top of that obstacle, which you couldn't see in the ship because it was high tide, and it would explode the ship. Well, the Allies don't do that. We came in at low tide. What's the downside of low tide? The downside is you got to go a long way up that beach running after you've been soaked with water, hoping your gun is going to work while you're being shot at. And so I'm not sure what the better alternative would have been, but in fact, you can imagine Mr. Carl coming in at something like this where there's low tide and a lot of beachhead. Next slide, please. This was the most emotional place that we visited, and I think it was for everyone. And they sort of warned us before we got out there. This is the American Cemetery at Omaha. Olivia is going to do some history on that. And I want you to, when she shows you the slide she has, and it's black and white, the photograph, I want you to remember these because it's the exact same photograph, just different time. So these are the ones that I took. And there I am walking through it. I put the lily pads in here because they had a huge pond or a reflecting pool. They would not, that's very southern, wasn't it, to call it a pond. It was a reflecting pool, and I like lily pads, so I took a picture. But then you have all the crosses, and I'm not going to take anything away from what she's going to tell you, but it was really hard to walk through it. Because you think about these people, a lot of these people were the same age as my students, you know, that are buried there who never got to come home. I also want you to see that in the main picture there, can you tell that behind all the crosses is the ocean? And I think that's so cool because actually Omaha Beach, this cemetery overlooks where so many of American soldiers came ashore. And I thought it was very fitting that it was right there where many of them did not make it. Now I will say, and Olivia will also talk about this, that not everyone buried in the American cemetery died on D-Day, but many of them did. Next slide, please. This is it. You're at the end now, finally. Dover, England. We arrived in Dover on June 16th. Very sad because we knew it was almost over. This ship came out, and you see it spraying water, and that was celebration that we'd arrived in Dover. And so they send out this ship to celebrate that we had gotten to the end of our expedition. And you see the white cliffs of Dover there. Next slide, please. We went to Dover Castle. It dates back to something like, 1400s. And it was really unbelievable. We walked all through the castle, and then if you see this picture to the, I have to think about which way is which. To the right-hand side, it looks like I'm walking down a tunnel. Do you see that? That was an illegal picture Rachel took because they told us you are not taking pictures down there. So she snapped one right when we walked in the tunnel. And we walked down into there. This is where, if any of you saw the movie, and I say that because you may know the movie more than the history, but Dunkirk. This is, okay, if you don't know anything about Dunkirk, this is where the British had gotten pinned down in France by the Germans. And they did a massive, the British had a massive plan to rescue those soldiers who were stuck on the coast of France. And they brought them back. You should watch that movie. But they brought them back, and when they brought them back, they put them in the bottom of this castle. And it had all sorts of tunnels in it to keep them safe. Churchill standed right outside the castle and looked and watched as the ships came in with the men, and they let us stand there where he had stood. And they also said he had like 4 bottles of champagne at that point. It was like 9 a.m., but that's Churchill. Next slide, please. And that's it. That's the end. We took a picture together on our last day right there at the castle, and there's Rachel and I on the ship as we were about to depart. Okay? At this time, we're going to shift gears to the other slideshow so the students can do their part. While we're doing that, does anyone happen to have a question or anything I could answer or I didn't make clear that you want to ask? It's okay just to yell it. No questions? Jeff's not ready, so you sure? Okay. So we will start with our part. The students' research project here was based on my European expedition, and it is entitled Impacts of D-Day and World War II, Global, Regional, and Local. Next slide, please. As you now know, my journey with these 3 other educators pictured here with me began in June of 2022. Based on my research, my students would study D-Day and draw conclusions from their interactions with historians, community members who came to our class, and other artifacts and oral histories they collected. Next slide, please. My students' project will take you on a journey tonight through D-Day using the scales of global, regional, and local impacts. Next slide, please. This graphic is a teaching strategy I learned during my National Geographic Educator Certification course. As you see here, the scales of global, regional, and local are already displayed in grayscale, moving from the furthest right inward to the left, where a student is holding a globe. We will also subtly demonstrate for you varying perspectives in this presentation, including those of spatial, cultural, political, economic, historical, ecological, and geological significance. Next slide, please. Leslie will now come up and begin our student portion of the presentation with the global scale of tides and oceans. Next slide, please.
The tides at Normandy, France, as compared to the North Carolina coast, are vastly different. In 1944, along the French coast of the English Channel, the tidal range from low tide to high tide was more than 20 feet. Typically in North Carolina, we experience 2 low and 2 high tides in 24 hours, and the coast can reach tidal levels up to 6 feet. Next slide, please. Tides were a key factor in the invasion of June 1944 along the French coast. Massive amounts of rainfall forced a postponement of the original invasion date, which was June 5th. The weather reports as given to General Eisenhower predicted a 36-hour break in the weather on June 6th, when the invasion actually happened. Next slide, please. Unexpected strong tidal currents moved the American, Canadian, and British invaders more than 1 mile to the south of the intended landing spots. The tidal and lunar diagram for Omaha Beach for June 5th through the 21st shows Dudeson's predictions on tides that were provided to military commanders. This includes moonlight and degrees of twilight, both vital information for a successful invasion. Next slide, please. War has always had a great impact on oceans. Pollution from shipwrecks occurs when ships sink and fuel oil leaks into the seas. The American cargo ship, the USS Richard Montgomery, pictured here, was an ammunition ship that was sunk by German bombers in the Thames estuary. Ammunition and metal shells are still submerged and corroding today. Next slide, please.
The British Royal Navy made the decision for the Allies to leave England from Solent, a strait of water between the Isle of Wight and Great Britain. British World War II historian Stephen Fisher is seen here explaining the embarkation process to our American history teacher, Miss King. Next slide, please. This map shows the different beaches used during the Allied invasion. Of all of the beachheads, Omaha was the most dangerous on June 6, 1944, because troops were ferociously pinned down by gunfire for most of the day while coming ashore. Next slide, please. Harbors were built out in the ocean so that landings of equipment could occur further out once the Allied troops had secured the beaches. Harbors were concrete beaches in a sense. They provided calmer waters on the inside of the harbor barrier so that rough seas could not destroy boats or cargo as they were docking. In total, 4 million types of supplies, 1/2 million vehicles, and 2.5 million men were brought ashore during the Allied Normandy invasion. Next slide, please.
The heaviest concentrations of German resistance were at the English Channel at Calais and Dunkirk, an area called the Dover Straits. The Germans created an Atlantic wall across the coast of France. The heaviest concentrations of German pillboxes and machine gun nests were at ports and harbors overlooking beaches with easy landing access. Easy Red along Omaha Beach was one of the deadliest locations for Americans landing there on June 6, 1944. Next slide, please. The Germans had been preparing for a total of 4 years, building reinforced concrete bunkers along the French coast. It was nowhere near enough and was not complete on June 6, 1944. Shown here is a picture of a bunker Miss King visited this past June at Easy Red along Omaha Beach. Next slide, please. Omaha Beach had the greatest potential as a landing area because it was between two cliffs. The Allies wanted to make the Germans think that they were going to take the shortest and most obvious sea crossing at Calais. Instead, the Allies landed further south. Next slide, please. Olivia will now share regional impacts. Next slide, please.
The Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial in France is located in Colleville-sur-Mer, on the site of a temporary American cemetery established on June 8, 1944. Tulane professor Mark Bilski is seen here discussing the construction of the cemetery with Miss King. This was the first American cemetery on European soil, and 9,386 American soldiers are buried there. It covers 172.5 acres and receives over 1 million visitors per year. American taxpayers pay French gardeners for cemetery upkeep. Next slide, please. Miss King only saw 1/3 of the cemetery during her hour-and-a-half tour, which tells you how large it must be. Today, the area appears beautiful and peaceful, overlooking Omaha Beach. 3 Medal of Honor recipients are buried there, and 45 sets of brothers lie side by side in the cemetery. Next slide, please. We will now highlight 2 men buried in the American cemetery. Elbridge M. Park entered service from Guilford County, North Carolina. He was a navigator with the 711th Bomber Squadron, and his plane exploded over France while on a bombing mission. He was last seen exiting the plane with his parachute on fire. Next slide, please. Private Clyde Garland Bumgarner was in the 357th Infantry Regiment, 90th Infantry Division, U.S. Army. He was from Burke County, North Carolina, and he received the Purple Heart for combat-related injuries. He was killed in action on July 7, 1944. He was 19 years old. Next slide, please. Kelsey will now share local impacts. Next slide, please.
Oral history is important because it provides a more accurate picture of the past from someone who lived it firsthand. It can also help fill in the gaps of historical documents. It preserves a sound portrait of where we are in the present and how our past shapes our now. Oral history is how we learn the story of Carl Scott, a Chatham County native and World War II veteran. Carl grew up and lived most of his life in Harper's Crossroads, a community in Bear Creek, North Carolina. He was drafted into the war on February 26, 1941, and was sent to Fort Denning, Georgia. He would survive the war and be honorably discharged on July 28, 1945. His travels and the stories we will share with you show his bravery, good fortune, and his sense of humor, all of which helped him survive the war and most especially survive D-Day. Next slide, please.
Please begin playing the embedded video. As you can see from this Google Earth visual we created, Carl Scott departed with his unit from Fort Bragg on November 2, 1942, headed for Casablanca, Morocco, into the North African Campaign. From there, he and his unit fought their way into Tunisia. They then boarded a ship that would take them to Sicily and then through the Strait of Gibraltar, which he stayed awake to see for himself. He retired for the night, believing he and his fellow soldiers were headed back home to the U.S. When he awoke the next morning, he was in England. The unit was told that they would participate in D-Day and needed to prepare for the Allied invasion of Europe. On June 6, 1944, Carl Scott crossed the English Channel, landing on Omaha Beach, specifically Easy Red Beachhead, which was a death trap for many American soldiers. He survived D-Day and would drive his truck, building roads, bridges, and moving supplies through France and Belgium, supporting the Battle of the Bulge. From there, he traveled to Germany until finally arriving in Czechoslovakia at the end of the war. Next slide, please. Mr. Scott was an exceptional soldier. He was awarded 14 medals, and he deserved every medal on this slide. The Bronze Star is given to a soldier for their acts of heroism. The Silver Star is given to a soldier for fighting in action against an enemy in armed conflict. It is a great honor to receive these medals. The Marksman Badge has the representation of a target placed in the center. Mr. Scott received rifle qualification for an M1 rifle. He was a great shot, but intentionally missed at times during basic training, as he did not want to be a sniper. Snipers were a major target for the enemy. The Motor Vehicle Driver and Mechanics Badge demonstrates specialization in certain motor vehicles. Next slide, please. The 3rd grade technician patch denotes that Mr. Scott was a technician for the U.S. Army. He helped build roads and clear paths for the Army. Mr. Scott also drove trucks and large vehicles. For example, he drove a duplex driver amphibious tank. The Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal was awarded to Mr. Scott because he was a participant in the amphibious assault landing on D-Day. Next slide, please.
In later years, Mr. Carl Scott would seldom discuss the war. We are fortunate to have a video in his own words to share with you today. It is of Mr. Scott retelling a moment where he came under German fire while driving a truck with supplies. You will see his sense of humor vividly here, even in dangerous situations. Please play the video.
I had to stand in my truck.
Right.
And a lot of times I get on the fire, and these boys that worked in the company working on the road, they had to stay right there and do whatever,
Right.
the boss man tell them to do. If I was driving the truck, if I got under the fire, I left there.
Yeah.
I pulled up one time and I heard the shell come over and it landed over there, and I got down inside this little ditch there, and that thing just and went on over. I think to myself, that don't get me, I'll leave here. It didn't get me, and I got at my left there of that truck. That was the good part about being a truck driver.
Right.
Push
You
you
could
to
move
bigger
around.
targets,
Right. But you
But-
still were mobile where everybody else
Yeah.
had to follow orders.
I could do whatever I wanted to do. I got in a pretty bad situation one time. I was hauling gravel and I was going back, and they got the Germans had got the shelling a bivouac area over there, another outfit, and they were coming out. I kept hearing something. I thought my tailgate was falling down, Come find out the shells hitting. And I got up and the convoy was coming out, and you ain't supposed to pass the convoy, but I passed it.
What's the
Passed that
convoy?
convoy.
What's the convoy?
Troops leaving out
Right.
on trucks.
Jeeps and stuff.
Yeah. Trucks and jeeps and I wonder they hadn't turned me in, but I guess they was wanting to say they're high too,
Yeah.
But I passed the colonel and he was up at the front, leading. You ain't supposed to pass a convoy like that if they're
Yeah.
moving, but I passed every one of them. They was coming
They
out of
wasn't
the
moving
place.
fast enough, was they?
They was coming out of the woods, and I was coming down the road and I had to stop for them. And they were just near about bumper to bumper, and one guy, he sort of got lazy. And I slipped in between them, then I passed him.
Well, so the Germans were behind you?
Yeah, they back behind.
Well,
Shelling. Well, of course, they was way over,
Right.
throwing the shells over.
You wasn't in any immediate danger, but you was going to make sure you wasn't.
Well, One of them shells could have hit me,
Well, that's true.
but I didn't see no eyeballs.
Well, did the convoy not stop and fight them?
No, they was leaving out. That's the reason they was leaving. It got too hot for them.
Next slide, please. Carl Scott was a member of A Company 20th Engineer Battalion. This company was assigned to support the 1st Infantry Division of the U.S. Army on D-Day. Many of A Company's members would land on the east side of Omaha Beach that day. The 20th Battalion was widely distributed on landing craft. In the words of historian Stephen Fisher, and I quote, "No entire unit went on one single vessel, as if it was lost, the entire unit would be knocked out. So there are handfuls of men and vehicles on a variety of vessels." End quote. This makes it a bit more difficult to locate exactly which vessel Carl Scott was on. However, with the help of Mr. Fisher, we think we've found it. A Company of the 20th Engineer Battalion had members assigned to LCT, or Landing Craft Tank 69. Mr. Fisher believes this is most likely the location of Mr. Carl Scott. Quoting Mr. Fisher, "As he had a motor vehicle driver and mechanic badge, I'd be inclined to think he was with one of the vehicles." End quote. And therefore, on Landing Craft Tank 69, please see the chart here, which explains this information. It shows there were 30 men with multiple vehicles, such as a Jeep, a trailer, and a dozer. It also shows where the landing area would be for Easy Red on Omaha, and the landing time would be 7:30 a.m. At least that was the Army's hope. Ultimately, it would not work out that way, and Easy Red would be one of the bloodiest sights on D-Day. Next slide, please. Mr. Scott was discharged from the U.S. Army on July 28, 1945. He returned home to Chatham County after the war. Mr. Scott had 2 children, 3 grandchildren, and 8 great-grandchildren. Travis and I represent 2 of the great-grandchildren that are here tonight and had the privilege to work on this local history project. We are proud that Carl Scott is our great-grandfather, and we are glad to share his story with all of you. Next slide, please.
In conclusion, we would like to provide you with a link to our research citations, which include more than 50 cited sources. Next slide, please. In addition, 32 Chatham Central American history students collaborated on this project and are listed here. Next slide, please. We wish to thank the following experts for assisting us in our research. Next slide, please. Thank you to each of you for coming out tonight and listening to our presentation. We hope you will come away from this presentation with a greater appreciation for our Chatham County local heroes. At this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to Mr. Jeff Chrisman.
Well, as Amy said, back some time ago, she asked Chris and myself and Jason about maybe coming to her class and telling what we might know from Granddaddy's days in the war. And if y'all knew Granddaddy very well, you knew he didn't talk about the war. So it was very difficult to get access to that kind of information. We didn't ask questions, and he didn't volunteer a whole lot. It happens that, as Amy King said a few minutes ago, when the kids were really small and Granddad and Willing were still living, Amy visited them quite often. And she'd take the kids up there and they'd visit, and Chatham Central High School was sending a student over to interview Granddaddy. And he was talking about he was going to have to answer some questions about the war. And, of course, Amy come home. I'd have come home and said, well, that sounds good. You know, and she came home and said, we're going to be there and we're going to video it. And so that was that turned into a whole project that she put together, a scrapbook. We went with him for reunions with his Army buddies. And so anyway, we're happy to be able to present what we know. A couple of things. The slide that you see here, I just put some facts. This is mostly what we showed to the class when we went that morning. I've edited it some. But on his discharge papers, which I didn't have at the time we went to visit the class, they actually discharged him as a technician 4th grade. That must have happened right before he was released, because all the pictures we have of him only have the 3 stripes. As you can see, he served from 2/26/41 to 7/28/45. He served 33 months overseas. One of the things we tried to relate to the students was, think about our ability to communicate these days. So you're 18, 19 years old, you have a cell phone, you can text, you can call anybody in the world. These guys went overseas at a time when they had none of that. They had no way to communicate with people back home, and most of them had never been anywhere before they left. So you think about the, just being that young and being sent overseas, and as you could see, he saw the world. A lot of it one step at a time. There was some of the things he did tell us over the years was, like during basic training, they all had to learn to swim. And if you knew how to swim, then you had to teach the other guys how to swim. So his story always was, I learned on the last day. He said, I knew when I went there, but I didn't want to have to teach everybody else. So again, that gets back to his personality. Next slide, please. If you visited in his home, this was on the wall. And this was just the motto of the 20th Engineers, to build and fight. It's in French, which I have 2 years of high school and two semesters of college. I still can't pronounce it. So it means to build and fight. Next slide. These were on his uniform, US 20, Company A. Next slide, please. Again, rifle and driver designation. Next slide. This was his technician, 3rd grade. This is what was on his uniform. It is in his metal cabinet over here. Next. And this is him in uniform. You saw this picture. The next slide, I believe, if you'll go there, I'm going to let Chris come up and talk about this one.
So most of y'all would know Everett, and I think Nancy here, she could probably back me up. I think he was 19 when he came in, but he come in after D-Day. But Jimmy was telling me all this. He thinks his daddy told him that they were in Belgium. But anyway, Granddad was down the road from Everett, and he knew that Everett's outfit, that's the way he would always say. He said his outfit was down the road, and he asked if he could take a Jeep and go down and see him. So he got that granted to him. So he went and got to see Everett, and Jimmy said that was the the highlight of Everett's time over there, because Granddad, he got put with people from North Carolina or nearby from the South. Everett got put with everybody up in the northern states, I'll say, and so he didn't really particularly like his guys. And but Jimmy said that he did continue to keep up with his guys after the fact, and but he did say that he was very happy to see Granddad, and Granddad was pretty much, he was 24, I think, at that, 23 or 24, and Everett was, of course, 19, but he was very happy to see Granddad, because that was the only person he had seen from North Carolina since he had left home at that point. So.
Just a little more background on that picture, though. Granddad and Everett grew up across the road from each other, for those of you who don't know. So, you know, it was, just imagine you've been overseas for some time and you finally get to see your first cousin that you grew up with. Next slide. I put this in here just because when Granddaddy reviewed his medals, he always liked to make a joke about the fact that he got a good conduct medal. So I just thought I'd share that little tidbit. Next slide. This may not be visible. I didn't show this to the kids because I didn't have it at the time, but this is his discharge papers. And what I found interesting in this, there really is a wealth of information on your discharge papers. For example, like when he went into the service, he weighed 128 pounds. He was 5'7". You know, other little tidbits. It talks about all the places that he visited, all of the shots he got, of course, and then it goes on to talk about, you know, when he was discharged, they charged him $6.70 for insurance. You know, it was just interesting tidbits. Next slide. Back to the previous interviews done by some students, which we think we've pinned down to 2003, because Anna Grace was a child. You'll hear her in the background in some of these videos. But it's best that we just let him tell things in his own words. So this is him talking about leaving out for war. Click the slide with the mouse. Click where it says travels. We'll be ready on the next one.
Well, we left Fort Benning and went to Camp Pickett, Virginia, and put all of our trucks and things on ships. Went on into Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, to ship out.
Where did it go?
I went on to Camp Kilmer, and then we got word that all of our equipment had been sunk. So we come back down to Camp Pickett, Virginia. They issued us new trucks and new equipment, and we went back and made the second start. So we made it all right at that time. Went in New York, Staten Island.
So after that, you went to Africa, or
Yeah.
okay,
Then from there we made the invasion of Sicily
from Africa.
from Africa.
Okay.
And then
Then
after
from
that,
Africa,
Well, you
Sicily.
took up minefields all across Africa, didn't you?
Yeah. Oh, a long time ago across Africa. We wasn't very long in Sicily. But we went on then to, from Sicily, we thought we were coming home. But we waked up one morning and they changed directions and we wound up in England. So that's where we left from to make the invasion of France.
Next slide.
Well,
Let's just play it.
so explain to me, I know y'all were in the engineers and your jobs were to build the roads and the bridges
Yeah.
and stuff like that. How did you end up fighting
Well,
during all that?
we didn't do none unless we just absolutely had to.
Right.
We built roads and bridges, but up there in the Hurricane Forest, we stopped at a place and our bivouac, and they wanted us to go on up and build a bridge. Well, see, I was a truck driver. I stayed back with a load of gravel to carry up to the bridge when they got ready. You know, we got up on the bridge and they had never loaded the bridge, so they pinned them down. Stayed pinned down up there for several nights. I went up to carry the mail and the food, you know, to them. We'd walk a mile or so up under the moonlight and snow on the ground, you know. You could just see a fellow a long ways, you know. We had one place, we had to go across a little field about as far as me out of my mailbox. And when you start across there, you had to go in a hurry because the Germans would throw a shell at you. You get so much speed you couldn't hardly stop when you got the wood. But you went across there in a hurry.
Yeah.
Along those lines, as you think about, okay, I was gone, he was overseas for 33 months, unable to communicate with people back home. He said that during one point in time, they spent an entire year sleeping outside. And you can imagine through all kinds of weather, as it would have been. Next slide, please.
So explain to me, I know y'all were in the engineers and your jobs were to build the road.
Are you going to talk about D-Day? Go ahead.
Well, D-Day, I drove a 2.5 ton dump truck loaded with dynamite and TNT. And we went off about, well, the sun had just come up good when we drove off. We were supposed to, we had our cosmoline all over the trucks and the motors and things, and you're supposed to get in the water. If they wasn't fixed right, they drowned out, but we had cosmoline all over them, you know. And we drivers were supposed to hang off on the side of the boat down in the water, so when the water come up in the trucks, you wouldn't take your foot off of the gas and drown and, you know, drown the motor. But we didn't do that. We didn't drop off on the side of the water. But we were supposed to come along. They told us to go up to a certain place up there about 1/4 mile from the beachhead and wait for further orders. We got up there, when we got off of the wow of the water, we had nowhere to go. They had never took the place over there. So we were pinned down there all day on the beachhead. Late that evening, we went up in, one other boy from my company, he had a truck and I had one. And we was going to put a camouflage net over the tube. And there was a sniper over in a big house. He took a pop at us and we never did put the net up. We jumped off. That night then, we
Got under the truck.
we had a big air raid over there that night. And a lot of people was asking where I went that night. Told me I got under a truck. And they want to know why I got under the truck. Said if something had hit that set it off, it'd have got killed. But if you'd have been anywhere close by, you'd have got killed anyway. Mm-hmm. So you were just as safe under the truck.
Y'all were pinned down under that truck
Yeah,
on the beach all day with
shrapnel. No, we wasn't under the truck all day. We was around too.
See, the Germans were still there.
I know, they were still shooting at y'all all day long.
Yeah, they were just killing people all up and down the edge of the water, you know. Well, and I went back to my truck. There was a piece of a man laying on the fender. I had to take my foot and kick it off before I could get in the truck.
And when you drove over, did you have
He'd just been hit, you know,
Yeah.
throwed flesh over him.
Yeah.
It was pretty hot. Well, they said that was the hottest place that the boys landed at.
Was when the lights were on.
What are your thoughts about
and the boys
about the
come
invasions of the Allies on D-Day?
That was the song.
Well, they done a good job. Both sides.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty tough. They had the Germans. They had barbed wire entanglement out to keep it from going out. And our boys are engineers. I've been engineers. We had to take that down before the infantry could go in there.
Mm-hmm.
It was tough.
Next slide, please.
Well, D-Day,
Yes.
I drove a 2.5 ton dump truck loaded with dynamite and TNT.
Anybody know how to run PowerPoint? Hey, here we go.
Long towards the end of the war, we was traveling so fast, and the Germans was wanting to give up. And a little civilian come up and told us about some Germans being over in a dairy barn, a great big old dairy barn. So the 2 or 3 of us went over, volunteered to go over there and get them. And this big dairy barn was circled around. There was a church over there, and they had a fence all the way around the building. And just as we crawled through the fence, they tingled the bell up in the church, you know. But we went on anyway and went into the big dairy barn. It had a loft. There wasn't anybody down where the cows stayed, but up in the hay barn, they were laying up there asleep or pretending to be asleep. So they had a ladder up there. We kept one man down in the floor, and 2 of us went up, and they'd raise up, and we'd throw a gun on them backwards and forth, you know. And we marched them back down the steps. That guy stayed downstairs. He kept them from doing anything damage to us. And we searched them. I got a pistol in here now that I got off of one of them, and I got a little knife, but I lost it. So we carried them on back to camp, and I had to take them and deliver them down to PO camp down there.
He went on to say that was a whole lot of trouble to have to deliver the prisoners, and that he didn't ever volunteer for anything else again. Next slide, please. This is the pistol that he got off of the soldiers. Next slide. This is another gun that he brought back. We don't really know the story behind it. He may have gotten this one at the same time. We're not sure. Next slide. He met Eisenhower, and we have a little clip of him talking about that. I thought that was cool.
What did I think of Eisenhower?
Yes, sir.
I thought he was a great man.
You met him, didn't you?
I liked him.
You met him, didn't you?
Oh yeah, yeah.
You met him. Really?
We was in the chow line fixing to eat a meal, and he came down through the crowd, you know, shaking hands with us, and he wanted to know, he asked me, he said, where are you from? And where I finished high school? And I said, Bonley High School. And he said, I know exactly where that is. And I think, Steph, you're lying to me. You just won't make me feel good. But he was a West Pointer, and he went from West Point down to Fort Bragg. He stayed in Fort Bragg a lot. So I guess he wasn't lying to me after all.
Next slide, please. See, it's just better if he tells it. I mean, he's... This is good where he's talking about working with Allied soldiers. I think you'll like this too.
did you work beside any other Allied soldiers like British or?
No, well, we was attached to the British at one time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were attached to the British at one time, but we didn't like it because they didn't have no coffee. They had tea, hot tea. We didn't like that hot tea, did we? They had tea at 9 and 3 every day.
Yeah, he liked his coffee, and now I didn't. He had told Jason that one of his jobs, because he had a truck most of the time, was he had to keep up with the coffee pot. So, anyway, he didn't like it when they had to have tea. Next slide, please. They asked him about concentration camps. I thought this was interesting. If it's just a little short clip here, so listen careful.
Would you share your thoughts about the German concentration camps?
Well, they pretty rough. I seen some of the camps where they had the people in there and everything. I don't know, they were just jumbled up, put together. It's like a bunch of dogs.
Did you know that millions of Jews were being destroyed during that time?
No, I didn't know anything about that.
I thought that was interesting that he was fighting this war and he really didn't know what was happening to the Jews. Now, I mean, you can imagine just being a soldier, told where to go, what to do. I mean, you didn't really know everything that was going on. Next slide, please. Okay, on the bombing of Japan. This is short and sweet too.
The decision to bomb Japan was critical to the end of World War II and the invasion of Japan. What were your reactions to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well, I thought they ought to go ahead and do something and get it over with.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was ready to come home. Next slide, please. This is on, trading mail back and forth from home. As I said, you couldn't call on your cell phone or talk. They could send letters back and forth, and they did censor those, and he talked about that a little bit.
They'd censor all that stuff. We couldn't. I couldn't even tell my people where I was at. They had everything censored. If I'd write home, I'd have to say somewhere in Africa, somewhere in France.
Did they read your letters you wrote home?
Yeah, they censored every one of them. They cut it out, black it out. You didn't tell nothing then. You couldn't tell nothing.
Part of what he says there when he said you couldn't tell nothing then, he was contrasting that with what we had just seen with the Middle East Desert Storm and all, where you could watch it right on TV, what was going on, and he didn't like that a little bit. He said, we're telling them everything we're going to do. He did not like it. Next slide. As Chris said, he had some good guys in his group, and some of them became lifelong friends. Visited on a regular basis. I remember these folks coming to Granddaddy's house about every year if they could. And, so he definitely made some lifetime friends and had a band of brothers over there. Next slide, please. Along about the time that we were doing the videos with him, we got an opportunity to go to Fayetteville, stayed in the Prince Charles Hotel, and had his 56th reunion with all of his guys there. And that was the ones that attended. You can see they're, obviously getting old by this time. But they were really close. When they got together, they talked and had a good time. But you know what they didn't talk about? The war. Next slide, please. We also got to go to Washington, D.C. For his final reunion. And we got to go to the World War II Memorial. Next slide, please. This is just a picture. I thought maybe If y'all hadn't seen him, this is what he looked like young versus old. And this is superimposed over the World War II memorial. Next slide. And this is he and Willeen, or Meemaw, as we called her, at the World War II monument in 2004. And I didn't put slides in there for that, but we took pictures of him in every country that he visited while he was there. You know, that memorial has a thing that goes around and it tells all the countries. Next slide, please. And this is the whole crew and the grandkids that were alive at the time. Hallie and Travis were not there at the time yet. They were just a little bit early for them. But that's all of us there. Next slide. I think that's it. Ms. King, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, we're just real thrilled you all came out tonight. I'm sorry that I didn't hire a better clicker. But we really appreciate it. And we were a little longer than we expected, but we appreciate your patience and listening. And most of all, just honoring Mr. Scott. So thank you for coming. Have a good night.